welcome and thank you for coming along to this launch and celebration of the Research Institute for Literature and Cultural History. We're really delighted that you're all here and we hope you're going to have an interesting afternoon. My name's Glenda Norquay and I'm going to say just a few words by way of introducing the event, the Institute and our subject, I suppose. Before I do that, I should say there is no fire alarm planned for this afternoon. If the fire alarm goes off, it's a real thing. And it is very hot in this room already, but we're hoping the air conditioning will start kicking in now, and if not, we'll bring in some fans. So the Research Institute has grown out of LGMU's Research Centre for Literature and Cultural History that was established about 20 years ago. Our research has long been recognised as quite unusual, not just, I think, because perhaps we were interdisciplinary before it became fashionable to be interdisciplinary, but also because of the innovative nature of our research. In the most recent external assessment of our research, we were praised not just for the rigour of our scholarship, but for our willingness to explore, quote, new and surprising fields of inquiry. And I think that's a good thing. Over the course of 20 years, staff and research interests have changed and expanded, and delivery of our research has changed too, as we began to think about different, more experimental ways of communicating the work we were doing. It's particularly exciting, therefore, that the Institute has been developed in collaboration with colleagues in creative writing, which, again, is an area of the university with a well-established and international reputation. Once again, we think through working together, the boundaries and the nature of our research will be shifting. Over the course of the afternoon, we're giving you a snapshot of some of the work of the Institute and the new directions in which we're moving. So the first session will give you a flavour of our research interests, and the second, and the tea break, of innovative models of delivering our research. And we will close with a plenary by our guest speaker, Professor Stephen Mentz, who is internationally recognised as an innovator in the blue humanities, and someone, I suppose, whose own research and delivery of that research embodies the new possibilities that we're interested in. Steve arrived from New York yesterday, so we're particularly delighted that he's here with us today. As you might have noticed, we've taken the theme of launch rather literally in our theme between land and sea. And this seems appropriate to Liverpool, a city and a region facing inwards and outwards as represented, of course, by the liver birds. And we're particularly pleased that we're here today at the Tate on the edge of the land and looking out to the sea. But we chose the theme of land and sea because I think it also represents a broader interest in mobility and movement that is one of the characteristics of our work. So in the presentations today, you'll see the different ways in which these themes are of specific importance to our research. But I think movement and migration and mobility perhaps goes beyond even that, to the very heart of our subject. So to illustrate that, if you'll indulge me, I am going to recount what I suppose you would call a shaggy dog story. And because my own research focuses on 19th century writer Robert Louis Stevenson, it is, of course, a Stevenson dog story. In his last and unfinished novel, St. Ives, set in the Napoleonic period, Stevenson tells the story of his eponymous hero, the French prisoner Anne Saint-Yves, St. Ives, escaping from Edinburgh Castle, travelling down through Scotland and England in various modes of transport, before returning to Scotland and a final and surprising escape in a hot air balloon. On the first part of his journey, the escaped prisoner is on foot in the company of 2 cattle drovers who take him down through the Scottish borders. They're rather bewildered by this strange character and assume that his odd accent means he must be English. Although rather taciturn by nature, on the journey, the drovers pass the time by telling stories. One of them is about an exceptionally intelligent sheepdog belonging to a man called Tweedy. We never hear the story, but I think it is probably based on one that Stevenson heard in his own childhood in the Scottish borders. Later in the novel, when our hero is on his own in England, trying to disguise his identity, the Frenchman reflects that because the strangeness in his accent had situated him as English, quote, if I could pass in Scotland for an Englishman, I might be able to reverse the process and pass in England for a Scot. I had a rich provision of outlandish words at my command, and I felt I could tell the tale of Tweedy's dog so as to deceive a native. And he does retell the tale of Tweedy's dog as a means of passing in a dangerous company and a strange land. Like the tale of Tweedy's dog, stories emerge from specific places and real people. But they are also always on the move, in transition, changing as they pass between us. They bring us together, they reveal difference, they fluctuate and migrate across space and time. Stevenson wrote this novel in the last years of his life when living in Samoa in the South Seas, remembering tales that had been told to him as a boy in Scotland. Known in Samoa as Tusitala, the teller of tales, he became increasingly interested in the ways in which he could exchange his own stories of the Scottish Highlands with the people of Samoa, finding points of commonality, but also, as he saw it, bartering with natives through narratives that were new and different. Tell me your story and I'll tell you mine. St. Ives was a hero on the move. Stevenson's life was also characterised by mobility. And literature, too, is always in transition. Stories that seem intrinsic to one culture or another, that appear to fix identity, are also always on the move, crossing and challenging borders. Although stories express our sense of self and our sense of place, they also shift across space and time, shaped a little differently as they migrate. And I think we'll see today, in our world of movement and mobility, the tales we tell are important. It's equally important to think critically and creatively about the stories we narrate and have narrated. And that's why, I suppose, literature is central to understanding ourselves, others, the world around us, and the relationships that operate between all those different elements. So I'm going to hand over now to someone who can speak with some confidence about the place of writing and literary studies in a changing world. Dr. Alex Thompson is the incoming head of English literature at the University of Edinburgh, but is also the outgoing chair of University English, which is our national subject association for the study of literature and creative writing. And he's also, as you'll see from the programme, a scholar with his own exciting and diverse range of interests. So I'm going to hand over briefly to Alex.
Incoming and outgoing, it's a bit like being stuck in a revolving door. It's potentially a little uncomfortable. Okay, well, hello everybody. It falls to me, I guess, to be the first person, and I'm sure it'll be in a long line, to congratulate my friends at Liverpool John Moore University English and the affiliated units who have kind of like been uplifted to form the Research Institute for Literature and Cultural History. And I congratulate them on behalf of the national subject community of English, which, as we know, isn't really a discipline because it's too many different things, but which for University English encompasses English literature, the study of the English language in all of its forms, and also creative writing, very importantly. University English, which some of you will have known as the CQ, the Council for College and University English, is an organisation which brings together English departments across the UK, shares good practice, it feeds into and rather grandiloquently claims to represent English studies in relation to processes such as REF or to lobby an organisation like the AHRC. And I think it's telling that Liverpool John Moores University's English department has a very long-standing relationship with CQ or University English, and I think that reflects their commitment to engaging nationally and beyond and being fully part of the subject community. And I just wanted to single out, and people hate this, but I'm sorry, Elspeth, who was, I think, the first person I spoke to over dinner at a CQ event, and I can probably blame for landing me in this predicament. And then current member of the executive, Kate Walchester, also head of English Studies at Liverpool John Moores. And as I say, this to me reflects the engagement of your university with the subject, and we're very grateful for that. We're delighted to see your work recognised. And I wanted to abuse your hospitality by just saying a little bit about how this development, fantastic as it is, might sit in the landscape for English studies more broadly, and particularly for research in English, which over the last maybe 2-3 decades has been characterised by, I think, at least two kind of like massive success stories. So firstly, the historical and archival turn in our discipline has really helped us articulate both the cultural value and the economic value of what we do. It's enabled us to reflect on our contribution to the cultural industries worth £100 billion a year to the economy at the last estimate and to the heritage sector, but just as much to understand our work as helping to foster the living of meaningful lives in all kinds of places through the interlinked understanding of social, cultural histories and individual lives. The second great success story, I think, is that the integration of creative writing, I mean, I'm not claiming to swallow up creative writing, but this kind of like dynamic and productive, interactive relationship with creative writing it's turned out to provide strong institutional support for literature as a living medium in an era when the publishing industry is no longer able to offer anything like a living wage for most writers. And obviously, people have seen a downside to that story, but it's a tremendous positive in keeping, I think, the cultural production of the United Kingdom going. Furthermore, the stress on articulating the impact of what we do has certainly strengthened our awareness of the relationship between the study of literature and the production of literature, between research and creativity, and between scholarship and the cultural industries. Understanding the connections between universities and the places in which they are found has renewed the idea of the civic, engaged university as a platform for interaction between writers, readers, and researchers. And I'm sure that all of these things are central and integral to the aims of the Research Institute for Literature and Cultural History. I just want to say something, a word of friendly advice and perhaps caution. That sounded more depressing than it was supposed to. But I was asked to think about the future and the current landscape. And as we all know, we live in times of tremendous uncertainty. And it's a cliche of management speak that a risk or a change is an opportunity. But I want to stress that that really is the case. So although it has happened in a pervasive climate of political and economic uncertainty, the formation of UKRI, UKRI, is, whatever else it is, I want to stress it's a golden opportunity for researchers in the humanities. The AHRC has pledged to continue to ring-fence 70% of its funding for its latest delivery strategy called Discovery-Driven Inquiry, inquiry driven by the curiosity of researchers. But, as we all know, that may become 70% of a smaller pot of money. Whereas, and here's the opportunity, an incredible amount more money will be made available for interdisciplinary, that is cross-council and challenge-based research. And as I've been talking to people over the last 2 years, in my role as chair of University English, what's become really clear is that what to really embrace this opportunity, we have to think a little bit about language, and who better than English studies to think about language. And the question really is, how do we talk to and work with not just our close relatives in the humanities, but what we sometimes call our distant cousins in the hard sciences? There's a danger when you feel under threat that you fall back into entrenched ways of understanding what you do. And I wonder sometimes whether when we hear a phrase like Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, we think industry. We think of some grotesque Victorian novel. And challenge sounds like the thing we say when we're trying to persuade a student that this essay is going to be good for them, or this exam is going to be good for them. But we're getting ourselves into the wrong mindset when we do that. And I'm going to close now, but what I suggest we might want to do is to begin to shift slightly the way we think from the content and the knowledge that we all have to thinking about the skills, the aptitudes and the dispositions that English studies in all of its varieties fosters. The global challenges that we face are not challenges which can be solved by science, technology or engineering alone. This is clear to everybody. And when we hear interdisciplinarity, we shouldn't hear that is something for someone else. What that is someone saying, we need people who are skilled in cultural understanding, who understand problems of translation, whether that's trans-historical or cross-cultural, or whether that's translation between different social spheres or between policy processes and the lived existences of people in precarious environments. Those are the skills, and they're fundamentally linguistic skills and problems of language that English studies is peculiarly rich in. We're by no means the only discipline to be in this situation. So when we hear interdisciplinarity, when we hear globality, when we hear challenge, when we hear leadership, these are all words which are asking for our input, and perhaps for us to set aside some of our understandings of what we do as historians, as students of literature, and think about ourselves as cultural translators, cultural mediators, and understanders of social process. And if we can take on that challenge, it's hard to avoid the language, that will be our third great success story for English studies. And I welcome the Research Institute for Literature and Cultural History, and I invite them, and amongst all the other amazing things they're going to do, to go between land and sea and do that. So.
Thanks, Alex. Yes, as Alex was saying, English has changed and is changing, and as you'll see in the papers this afternoon, our work is already very wide-ranging, very diverse. This afternoon we're really concentrating on the work of particular individuals that we thought you would like to hear about, but I would just at this stage draw attention to some of our bigger funded projects that you might also want to know about and that you can follow up on our website and by talking to some of the people in this room. So this is a bit of a shout out really to people in the room. But one of our big projects at the moment is the War Widows Stories Project, which is a collaborative project between Dr. Nadine Muller, who is there, and the War Widows Association of Great Britain, and it's funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the British Academy, Arts Council England, and the Heritage Lottery Fund. And this project researches, articulates, and celebrates the lives and experiences of the wives and families that service personnel and veterans leave behind. Our Early Modern Soundscapes project, led by Dr. Rachel Willey, who can't be here this afternoon because she's doing an event related to that project, is an HRC-funded network that examines how sonic interactions shaped identities between 1500 and 1800. In creative writing, we have a number of prize-winning poets and dramatists working on national and international stages, two of whom you'll hear from this afternoon. But I would draw your attention to a really exciting new collaboration in creative writing with Liverpool in Sydney and a Liverpool to Liverpool project, which will bring writers and artists from Liverpools around the world to the city for creative partnerships. We have the Writing Lives project, led by Dr. Helen Rogers, and Emily Cumming, you'll hear from later, is a project that involves both staff and student research, working to create a digital archive of working class autobiography. And again, you can read about that on the website. Our Marginal Irish Modernisms project, which began with AHRC network funding, led by Professor Jerry Smith, who I don't think is in the room at the moment. He's probably working on his sea shanties, and is now being taken forward by the work of Declan Donnelly, over there, who has got his own British Academy fellowship to work on Wilde and Irish modernism, and a project that will culminate in a large conference held in conjunction with the Clark Library in California. Through Professor Elspeth Graham, there you are, we've played an important part in the Shakespeare North project, a project I'm sure some of you will be already very familiar with, a 32 million heritage-based urban regeneration project located in the Liverpool City Region borough of Knowsley. Do talk to Elspeth about it. Another new development is the Decolonising Feminism project, supported by the Global Challenges Research Fund, led by Dr. Fiona Tolan, who is hiding in the middle there. And finally, and this is really just a kind of watch this space shout out, Mike Perfect, sitting over there, is the first person to have access to the archive of the novelist Andrea Levy, a writer herself fascinated by movement and migration and the stories they produce. So watch out for further events that will come out of this great resource. So there are lots of exciting things going on, some new and some very well established. So I'm now going to hand over finally to someone who is very well established and who has known our work at LJMU for quite some years. So Professor David Amigoni was the first PhD student in literature and cultural history, or whatever it was called then, at Liverpool John Moores. He's currently PVC Research at the University of Kiel. He's a member of the REF panel in English. He's an expert on Victorian intellectual life. He's someone who lives and breathes interdisciplinarity. And as someone who knows us very well, I'm going to ask him to close this session, David.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And it really is a genuine pleasure to be invited here to speak this afternoon about a place that's meant a great deal to me, that continues to mean a great deal to me, because it really started my career. It's wonderful to hear Alex's kind of account of the state of the discipline and the opportunities, and I'll come back to that in a little while. But when I first arrived here in 1985, I don't think I had any sense of what those opportunities might be. But to underline the importance of what was then Liverpool Polytechnic, but which became Liverpool John Moores University, what it represented at that time needs to be properly understood, I think, by this anecdote, which is that in 1985, I was holding an offer from the British Academy, who funded PhDs at that time, to go to Warwick University and to study my PhD there. But I also came here for an interview to be appointed as research assistant for what was called then, Glenda, the degree in literature, life and thought, very Cambridge 1950s. And what that Cambridge 1950s label really didn't tell us about was the profound intellectual excitement that was generated in the polytechnic sector in the 1980s. Because if you wanted to do interdisciplinarity, and you wanted to do it ambitiously, adventurously, then in many ways the polytechnic sector was the place to come. The place that led the way through the journal Literature and History, was Thames Polytechnic, which became the University of Greenwich. And so for me, this opportunity to come and find out about higher education and to do a PhD in this very exciting environment made me actually disregard and turn down the offer to go and work at Warwick with the British Academy. Glenda said, "Did you ever regret it?" No, I've never regretted it. In fact, it's in a higher education sector that is too obsessed with status and with stories about prestige. It's really important to be able to underline the fact that research quality and intellectual adventurousness and ambition happens at every stage in our higher education system, and it has done for many decades, and it's really important to underline that. So a personal anecdote to start with, just to be also added to the fact that when I arrived here in 1985, as many of us did, I think Glenda arrived at the same time, those taxis were really going up and down Liverpool and handing out redundancy notices, and the Polytechnic was part of that. Was part of that system. So it was a very exciting place to be in 1985 as well. Anyway, what we've come here today, above all, to celebrate is the launch of the Research Institute for Literature and Cultural History, which has grown out of the Literature, Life and Thought programme, which I knew when I came here. And the commitments to expand research, to enhance the international strategy, to give greater coherence to your postgraduate offer, and it's very humbling to be here as the first PhD student because there have been so many since. And also to be able to develop that kind of civic mission of the modern university. It's a real pleasure to be able to celebrate that. And just perhaps for me to reflect for a moment on what I came to in 1985. I came to a place that was particularly committed to expanding the understanding of the interdisciplinary relationship between literary and historical studies. And there were specialisms in 17th century early modern writing, 19th century, which became my own field of expertise, and contemporary writing as well. And it's been brilliant to go and see your website. And incidentally, one point I'd make about your wonderful website is that it has an image of the fantastic round reading room in Liverpool Library. I worked there. I used its amazing 19th century collections when I was doing my work. And it's wonderful to see the growth of that intellectual agenda in the projects that we see today. Not only the outstanding research that you're publishing here, but the way in which that is translating into fora for public engagement. So, for example, the wonderful Shakespeare North project that Glenda was talking about, which is, I think, a beacon for outreach and raising cultural and educational aspiration. I'm delighted to see from my own field the use of the Sefton Park Palm House for Fern Crazy, which is part of the exhibition, part of the Being Human exhibition, sponsored by British Academy and Arts and Humanities Research Council. When I came here in 1985, I learned about gender. I learned about feminist criticism. I learned principally through working with Glenda. So again, it's brilliant to see the internationalization of that perspective in decolonising feminism. The conference, the symposium that was held back in June of this year. My own expertise became in 19th century writing, particularly life writing and biography. There's always been a commitment to that profoundly intellectual and profoundly interdisciplinary theme, and it's great to see the continued expansion and emphasis on that in Helen Rogers' project on writing lives. And I just want to finish off really with a reflection on the integration of creative writing into what you do. I think the integration of creative writing into the teaching and research of English in the higher education system has been one of the great success stories of the last 20 years. We're very proud that at Keele we've been through a similar kind of journey. And I just want to echo Glenda's points about the importance of creative writing, both as something that we study historically in literary forms, but also as a living and developing practice now. Because in a way, creative writing is the imaginative route to social impact. You could not wish for a stronger form of endorsement of that agenda. And, you know, literature and writing really are moving and migratory systems. They move between people, as Glenda pointed out in her introduction, and they're moving in every sense, both from the sense of translation between people, but moving in an emotional and cognitive engagement as well. So I would agree with Alex that the time is absolutely perfect for this kind of development. You are in a wonderful position to address things that do regularly cross my desk as a PVC for research, which is the industrial strategy, challenge-led funding. We can do this from a humanities and arts perspective. So I'm really looking forward to the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We're very proud of you. So we're now going to move into the panel stage of the afternoon. You've got a sense of where we are now, and from today onwards, we hope we're just going to grow and expand and develop new relationships, new collaborations with people across the university, with people throughout the city and the region, and I think really with people across the world. So Kate is now I'm going to hand over to Kate and the first panel, which is on migration and mobility.
Thanks, Glenda. Well, thank you, David and Glenda and Alex, for such an encouraging and inspiring opening. That was wonderful. It's my job to chair the first part of the afternoon, which where we're going to look at individual people and their projects. And I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Emily Cumming. Emily has been with us since 2017, is that right? And she's moved from working on houses and gender to more recently working on, this is the watery element now, to working on sailors' accommodation, sailors' homes. And today she's going to be talking to us about writing by sailors and those kind of generic boundaries between writing a sailor's log and a sailor's diary. So thanks very much, Emily. Do you want to say? Yeah, I've done that. Is it John? Try that one. Is that loud enough? Yes? Okay. Let me just check that. Great. Okay, so hello. I'm going to talk briefly about a part of my current research project on 19th century seafarers' lives. And I should start by saying that there are significant aspects of this work that I've really developed from conversations and exchanges, and indeed through teaching with my colleagues here in English, and I'm grateful to them. So at the moment, I'm working on a book that will explore family and kinship in the context of ordinary sailors' lives, and how commonly held ideas of home and belonging might be reconfigured in terms of the maritime world and portside communities. The life of the sailor, it goes without saying, of course, exists precisely between land and sea, the theme of this event. In practical terms, the kinds of ordinary merchant sailors whom I explore in my work lived lives that were defined by an extraordinary mobility as they travelled aboard trading ships which crossed the world, providing the labour force which propelled the 19th century global economy. One aspect of the sailor's identity, caught between sea and shore, comes up repeatedly in descriptions of sailors in port cities. Observers remark that the sailor seemed distinct from the landsman, an instantly recognisable and knowable type. You could read him on the surface. Oh, yeah, of course. So is the sound better if I put the mic towards me like this?
could just lean forward. Yeah? Is that better? Okay, and I'll speak a little bit more loudly. Okay, so I was saying that there was this idea that you could perhaps read the sailor on the surface, or it was thought that you could, since he was visibly delineated through his rolling walk, his characteristic clothes, his tattoos, his nautical slang, his suntanned skin. And popular 19th century journalists and novelists, from Charles Dickens to Arthur Morrison, produced elaborate urban sketches that portrayed the sailor enjoying his liberty away from the ship, cruising the streets of port cities known as Sailor Town. Jack ashore, as the sailor on land was sometimes known, was marked by a set of dualities. Known for his skill and know-how on board, on shore he was seen as naive and easily swindled. He was manly, yet strangely childlike in these descriptions of him. A global traveller, but lacking in worldliness when it came to looking after himself and his money. And the duality of identity is marked by the symbol which occupies the gates of the Liverpool branch of the Sailors' Home, an institution built in the city in 1844 and which provided accommodation for seafarers as they waited for outgoing ships. And here is the twin-tailed mermaid, sometimes known as Melusine, the creature who famously moves between land and sea at great sacrifice to herself. And the twin tails are thought to represent earth and water, body and soul. Now, I've become interested in these common but elaborate descriptions of sailors caught seemingly between two worlds. But I've also wanted to explore a little further the sailor's life and identity beyond the popular images and urban myths that surrounded him. And this has led me to explore other questions raised by scholars such as Hester Bloom in the US. For example, we know how sailors were seen, but what do we know of what sailors saw? How did they reflect on those contradictions and dualities that seemed so striking to the observer? What might we learn in turn from the copious writing if we turn from the copious writing about sailors to sailors' writing? Developing this last question, we have, of course, the famous accounts by sailor authors, such as Herman Melville and Joseph Conrad, whose published works have given a rich insight into the seafarer's life. But I've been interested in something different in this current project. I've wanted to try to uncover how sailors of the ordinary and lowest ranks navigated their existence between land and sea, how they maintained or developed kinship on the oceans, and how those who could write did write about these things. Now, one invaluable source which allows us to explore these issues are the various forms of autobiographical writing which exist in archives, such as the one held right here in Liverpool at the Merseyside Maritime Museum, just across the dock. The archives have a rich collection of personal accounts, including memoirs, letters, and reports of voyages that probably weren't intended to be published and have often been deposited as family papers. So I'm going to talk very briefly about just one form of this type of life writing, the report of a voyage, or the sea diary, which is how I think of it. So these writings are both a unique kind of travel writing and an odd form of autobiography. They really are a strange fusion of the two genres. So we find the shape and rhythms of the ordinary diary recounting dates and events, crossed with the style of the ship's log, which located the vessel's position in time and space and the essential work conducted on board ship. While such writing doesn't tend to be autobiographical in the confessional sense of the genre, I'm going to suggest that it is revealing of personality and viewpoints in other ways. So the accounts give us a valuable insight into the sailor's life on board ship, his daily routines and his sightings of sea life and land. And in a number of cases, they also contain more informal sketches or doodles of what sailors observed or were thinking about, such as these ones on the slide. So these are sketches by Charles Cartwright, who was a 16-year-old apprentice on his first voyage from Liverpool to South America. His diary log includes what might be a sketch of his home, and possibly maybe his mother sketched above that image of home. And later, as the ship arrives at his destination towards the end of the diary, he draws a map of Natal. Such writings can tell us about the bright-eyed hopes and intentions of a young man who set out to see the world, such as this list, which prefaces the account by a 13-year-old apprentice sailor from Liverpool called George Haram. So he was perhaps a little optimistic about the amount of time he would find for reading as he embarked on a 9-month journey on the trading coast of Chile and Peru. I don't know if you can see some of the titles for yourself there, but among his list, he's got Principles of Geometry, Franklin's Travels and Maps, Shakespeare, Paradise Lost, and an English grammar. He also has another list just above this book list, and it's the contents of his sea chest, and he details every single thing he was taking with him on that journey. The sailor's enduring attachment to land and family makes itself clear through the shape of some of these writings. For example, where we find letters from home inserted into the notebook, in a kind of scrapbook form perhaps, or transcribed into the diary itself, so the words of a family member actually form part of the accounts. One imagines the pleasure or comfort sailors might have found in tracing out and recording the words of a loved one, although it could also be that there are practical reasons why you want to copy out a communication contained on a piece of flyaway paper on a ship. So it's practical reasons as well as more symbolic or sentimental ones. The accounts are often moving. Neil Smith, a carpenter turned sailor on board a ship bound from Greenock in Scotland to Java in 1876, kept a log of his 2-year journey. But page after page of his voyage diary is filled with reflections on his feelings of loneliness, even as he works alongside the crew. And he repeatedly comments on how much he misses his wife and children far away in the Highlands. So this is obviously just a small snippet from the transcription of Mansfield's diary, but it gives a flavour of this style of entry in his language and his spelling. So Monday, April 9th, 11 months since I left my dear Jane and children. When we parted, I thought I would be home before this time, but instead of that, we are still going further from home. It is a long, wearisome journey. The cook is laid up with scurvy. That makes 2 and another complaining. We've got a fair wind today. I hope it will continue. I'm sorry, I did say that was Mansfield. No, it's Neil Smith. This is Neil Smith, the carpenter. But this is George Mansfield, who's another sailor travelling from Liverpool to San Francisco. And he describes in some detail the wonder of observing marine life from the ship, and he describes seeing meteors over the sky at night. But his diary also shows just how much home played on his mind. So Monday, May 17th, 1869, commences with strong winds and nasty head sea, noon light winds. Today I've been led to think about home more than I think I ever have since I've been away. I have been fancying I see them at home enjoying themselves, and I wish I was there with them. While the texts I've been describing are historical documents, they're also interesting and telling forms of writing, which require a different sort of reading and approach, particularly if they're being read as autobiographical forms. In her wonderful book on diaries, called The Extraordinary Work of Ordinary Writing, Jennifer Siner suggests that so-called ordinary diaries by people who weren't writers as such can serve to turn our attention away from what the writing does, so whether it's coherent, valuable, literary, or readable, and towards what the writer is doing. And I think this is really important in the context of the sea diary. Occasionally, some of these diaries do offer tantalizing glimpses of the tales of adventure that we might expect from maritime fiction, a dramatic storm, a drunken captain, a burial at sea. But often the diary entries center on repetitive and so-called ordinary events, variations in the weather, the work performed, cherished moments of leisure. Time is alternatively regulated, it's stretched and sometimes interrupted in these accounts. And sailors are given to repeatedly counting and marking days by numbers. They log their encounters with other ships, the receipt of letters from land, and they measure the days since they left port and anticipate how long it's going to take them to reach their destination. The diaries map the sailor's passage through time. Reading these diaries, it's hard not to be struck by what is their strange kind of oceanic rhythm, a sort of incantatory, almost verse-like form which chronicles the repetitions of time-disciplined labour on board, and the weather, again, the passing of days and the writer's moods. In itself, the monotony of this repetition is significant because it's a marker of safety. Maritime work could be deadly, and the repetition itself, the diary entries, signify that the journey is going according to plan and that the writer has survived the voyage. As a final point, it is worth remembering or reflecting on the fact that these accounts from the archives, in their sea-stained and delicate form, are in and of themselves unique and precious objects, whose survival against the odds really tells us just how much they meant to the person who wrote them or the family members who may have preserved them over the years. From accounts we have in sailors' memoirs, we know how hard it was for sailors to physically keep hold of their personal possessions on board ships. And so we can only imagine how much care these items, made up of the precarious materials of paper and ink, would have required as they made their way across watery worlds. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. I'm sure we've all got lots of questions and we'll want to discuss parts of Emily's talk and the other people's that you're going to hear this afternoon. Unfortunately, we've crammed so much in for you today that there won't be time for questions. So we're hoping that you can use the opportunity over coffee and later over dinner to talk to our speakers. And again, I think the room's very hot, isn't it, in here? So what we're going to try and do is we'll have the next two speakers, and then we'll have a little break for you to get some water from the back if you haven't already done so, and perhaps stretch your legs for 5 minutes before we carry on. So we won't make you sit here all the way through till 3:30. Okay, so it's my pleasure to invite to speak now Professor Cathy Cole, who's Professor of Creative Writing. Cathy came to LJMU in 2017. Her work has had over the years, I think, quite a watery theme, and she's going to continue that today by you're reading a short story called The Sea, an extract from The Sea. Is that right? Yes. Could you give us a little bit of an opening and a context for that as well?
I think I can reach, yeah. I'm going to read a memoir, a piece from a memoir, which is actually a book that's one of those hybrid ones. It's a book about memory and migration and how countries travel with us, and it's interwoven with sections of family memoir, partly because I sort of grew up in Yorkshire in Sydney, and I'm very interested in the way countries travel when people migrate. So the bit I'm reading is really a part of the family story. My brother doesn't remember much of our family's departure from the United Kingdom on the Empire Brent. He was 5 years old at the time, and my sister had just turned 3. There were farewells and packing and decisions about which toys to keep and which to give away. Not the Hornby train set we fought over years later, thank goodness. That cardboard box full of perfect replica steam trains, tracks and tiny people, and tin platforms with tin stations, painted to look like brick. The family possessions were packed into a motley assortment of trunks, some leather, some wicker, and wooden crates, all carefully marked for the hold. Weather-appropriate clothes were anticipated for a journey that would take them from the Glasgow wharves along the west coast of the UK and France, past Gibraltar, through the Suez Canal, then down the long stretch of Indian Ocean to Fremantle, their first Australian landfall. As I walked around my parents' old stomping grounds in Yorkshire on my first visit to England, I couldn't help wondering how they'd done it and how they'd just upped and left. They'd always been cautious people. How had they gathered the courage to leave behind this close-knit northern community? It takes a lot of guts to do it even now, but back then, when they'd just survived the horrors of the war, their decision seemed particularly brave. I've travelled to far more places than my parents ever did, some requiring stamina or courage, some off the beaten tracks of tourism. Yet none of my trips seems to hold within it the sheer audacity of post-war mass migration of which they were a small part. Need drove people, as did the desire for escape and optimism and a determination to build a new life a long way from home. There is something special about embarking on a sea voyage that air travel can never match. A ship waiting at a dock, its engines pulsing, is a living thing. It carries a miasma, a veneer of all the memories of previous sea voyages, layers of salt and fuel, meals and luggage and people. The passengers on the Empire Brent would have felt this history settle on them as soon as they embarked, the ship's past sea stories whispering in their ears. My first visit to the UK in the 1970s was taken on a Russian ship, the Taras Shevchenko, named after a Ukrainian poet. I wasn't keen on flying, and anyway, I wanted to experience a voyage like the one my family had talked so much about. It's hard to describe the sea to people who have never been out on it, not the polite sea of pleasure cruisers sliding across the glassy surface of a harbour, the sheltered passage of a car ferry between islands, not water taxis or yachts scudding between buoys. In the middle of the ocean, landfall a week in any direction, the sea becomes friend and enemy, someone you flatter or pay homage to, bribe, cajole, curse. You learn why the ancient Greeks threw coins into the sea off Cape Sunion to appease Poseidon. For my parents, England receded with each day at sea. Yorkshire, Barnsley, Royston, gone. Brothers and sisters, uncles and aunts, the lady who ran the dairy, the publican, the Barnsley market stallholders, all gone. A week to landfall, nothing to see but sea, nowhere to go but sit by the rails watching the sea rise and fall, the water changing its mood to match the skies. They huddled on the upper deck, sometimes playing deck games, with a ball that disappeared overboard in the rough waters of the Bay of Biscay and into the family archive of sea stories that I could recite by the time I started school. On the Taras Shevchenko, I spent a leisurely 5 weeks travelling to the UK via New Zealand, Tahiti, the Panama Canal and the Dutch Antilles. It was a trip of sights and sensations from Port Venus near Papeete in Tahiti, where I stood in the same spot as Captain Cook and Joseph Banks when they observed the transit of Venus in 1769. Or when I watched the Chilean sailing ship, the Esmeralda, a four-masted barkentine, lowered behind us through the Panama Canal's various locks, her masts and rigging a spider's web against an enamel blue sky. Like me, most of the young passengers were the children of migrants, drawn homeward as salmon are to spawning grounds upstream. Children determined to experience for themselves what they'd already lived through their parents' memories. We partied and drank and danced our way across moonlit oceans, sailing closer and ever closer to our family histories. My parents' ship was far less luxurious. The Empire Brent had begun her maritime life in 1925 as the SS Letitia, and she carried passengers until World War II, predominantly between the UK and Canada. She'd even been here on the Mersey and had run into an Irish trading ship full of cattle and potatoes. As the Empire Brent, she boasted no library or indoor and outdoor swimming pools, bars and restaurants or floor shows like those we enjoyed on the Taras Shevchenko. No crew who metamorphosed from deckhands into balalaika-playing singers or dancing troops in Taras Bulba hats. Gulls call to one another through the Liverpool night. Superstition says they're the souls of drowned sailors calling from underwater to the living on the land. Raucous, they scream from buildings across the city's wharves and the stretch of treacherous water that is the Mersey. I hear them in the middle of the night, feel the low-flying flash as one streaks after some thrown food, catch a glimpse of an underwing as I walk to work, far up in the sky, barely visible against a dapple of clouds. The gulls follow the ships, pretend albatrosses, wingtips tingling in the slipstream, just a short way, just until the river meets the sea, and they turn landward again. A long sea voyage develops its rhythms quickly. No sooner have the gulls disappeared than the rituals begin. In calm waters like harbours and rivers, the ship moves forward towards her true purpose, the sea. Then, at the conjunction of the water, the ship begins to move differently. She rolls and pitches in these new currents. Anyone confident that they'll never experience seasickness might think again at this point. For my parents, the voyage offered a comfortable proximity to land for the first part of the trip. So close were they, the seabirds came and went like visiting relatives. Along the Clyde mouth, the Empire Brent sailed past Greenock into the Firth of Clyde and the inner sea. Travelling south in the Irish Sea, she passed between the Isle of Man and Northern Ireland. Did my father stand on the deck hoping for a glimpse of the mountains of Mourne, the subject of one of his favourite songs? Departing Glasgow at midnight must have meant these landmarks slipped by while the family was sleeping, but they may have watched as the ship passed Land's End, navigating towards the Cape of St Vincent on the southern tip of Portugal. As they saw the last of England, a clump of distant rocks on a milky horizon, did they feel a mix of freedom, exhilaration and anxiety, the sea heaving, the wind blustery, the clouds racing over them? I came and went to England 3 times by ship, via South Africa, via the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean, ordained by the seas that formed our family stories, our siren, our comfort, our beatitude. After church every Sunday, the uncomfortable strictures of our Sunday best clothes cast aside for more casual wear, the sea called to us, and we went to her. We picnicked under Manly Beach's Norfolk pines to tales of miners' union picnics in Whitby or Scarborough. We built sandcastles. We swam, impressing parents who would never learn to swim. At dusk, we caught a ferry back to the city, sailing past cruise liners moored at the overseas terminal, to Circular Quay, ringed by sandstone buildings, which glowed like the promised land in the golden dusk. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Our final speaker, we're going to stay on the shoreline now. We're going to stay just like those gulls between the land and the sea. We're going to be thinking about thresholds. And so I'd like to invite my colleague, Dr. Filippo Minozzi, and he's going to talk to us about a project that he's just starting, which is about threshold and about the shoreline and thinking about disembarkation. He's just finishing off a book at the moment, which is hopefully going to be published, well, is going to be published next year by Palgrave, which is about world literature, non-synchronization and the politics of time. So the borders of time rather than the borders of space or thresholds. But today he's going to be thinking about the shoreline. So I'd like to invite Dr. Filippo Minozzi.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. By the way, can you hear me if I speak like that? Thank you so much for introducing me, and I'm really honored to be here today. Today I'm going to spend a few words on a project that we recently started in collaboration with an international partner, the University of Naples, L'Orientale in Italy. So we are currently planning a conference in April 2020 in Procida, which is near Naples. And hopefully this will be the start of a long and prolific collaboration leading to special issue and other related projects. So today, basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the key ideas and questions that are at the heart of this collaborative project. However, considering where we are in Liverpool here at the Tate, I've decided that in order to introduce this project today, I'm not going to start by mentioning abstract concepts or ideas, but I wanted to start by mentioning a local landmark. Those of you who are from Liverpool probably know this very well, and those of you who don't know this, I really encourage you to visit it. So it's the artwork you can see on my first slide. It's an artwork by Anthony Gormley called Another Place, which consists of 100 body forms of Gormley himself. And since 2007, this artwork sits permanently north of Liverpool in a place on Crosby Beach. So has become a landmark really affiliated to Liverpool, to the identity of the region, and also a tourist attraction, even though you might know that this is a very controversial artwork. And so I'm going to introduce some aspects related to this artwork, which in my view really illustrate very vividly some of the key concerns that we're trying to explore in this collaborative project. Now, Anthony Gormley, in general, is famous for placing his artworks mainly not in art galleries, but at the heart of communities and landscapes. So these artworks are meant to interact in some way with the surrounding ecosystem or, background. Now, in the case of Another Place, even though the artwork was originally produced for a place in North Germany called Cuxhaven, when it was relocated here to Crosby, I think it's very interesting here to notice, to reflect on the very location, the place where these statues have been placed. Because, of course, they are on a beach, but they are on a specific place, which is the tide line. So one of the interesting things about this artwork is that it assumes different aspects according to the time of the day when you encounter it. And as a famous art historian, W.J.T. Mitchell, writes in his analysis of this particular artwork, Another Place is notable for the way it complicates the romantic image of the lone, singular figure contemplating the vast, sublime landscape. The advancing and receding tide must enhance this sense that as the sea rises and falls, the figures are descending into or emerging from the sea. Figure and ground each give away their motion and stillness to the other. Now, I think this is really fascinating because, first of all, even though the artwork itself is still, so it doesn't move, however, the landscape is acting as a force that is giving some of its motion to the artworks themselves. So there is a kind of transmission and exchange between figure and background here. And most importantly here, however, the effect given by the movements of the tide is that we're not sure whether these figures are supposed to be descending into the sea or emerging out of it. So the movement of the sea creates this effect, which is very ambivalent, very uncertain. And, of course, the tide line itself as a space, which is supposed to be a line delimiting and dividing neatly the land, territory from the sea, from water, actually becomes, through this artwork, a kind of more complex liminal space in which land and water overlap and exchange, their position. So I was intrigued by this artwork because, of course, it illustrates, it captures in many ways some of the complexities, really, not only of the relation between sea and land, which is the main topic of today's event, but more generally of the question of the border, which in an era of globalization, unfortunately, is becoming more and more central to our thinking of territoriality, identity, and community. And of course, the movements of the tides and the specific location of another place made me think of contemporary reflections on the very idea of the border, which is moving today from being considered like a line or a wall to a much more complicated space, a contact zone of interactions and movements. As Paolo Cuttitta writes in a recent essay on the topic, territorial borders manifest themselves in shape different from the traditional line and operate in new ways, independently from the classical spatio-temporal coordinates of fixity in space and continuity in time. State borders thus turn from fixed to mobile and flexible borders, from lines to dots and zones, from material to immaterial, from visible to invisible, from permanent to intermittent. So the border is something that takes place in space, but also in time, that mirrors not only the formation of communities, but also the movements of people and capital. And as you can see from the map of Britain that I've attached here to the slide, you can see this immediately in the year of Brexit. I knew I had to mention this. How if I ask you what are the borders of Britain, well, this is a very complicated question, but also geographically, you can see immediately from the map, for example, the different extensions and the stretching of the territorial waters of Britain now are subject to an intense debate and, negotiation. So, for example, there was a debate on the fishing permits and how, much they should extend or not. And the same with the extraction of oil or materials from the sea. So, of course, this is testifying how we cannot simply think borders as lines which are fixed and stable, which we can immediately identify and visualize on a map, but rather borders are becoming much more elusive and changing creatures, which vary according to different, political and historical interactions. As a very important philosopher called Etienne Balibar writes in one of his many interventions on the topic of borders, borders today are everywhere. They cannot be placed at the margins or at the edges on the shorelines of our communities and nations, but rather they are really at the center, at the heart of national and political communities. Borders are where, in other words, the very idea of who we are is constantly affirmed and negotiated. As Balibar writes, borders are no longer at all situated at the outer limit of territories. They are dispersed a little everywhere, wherever the movement of information, people and things is happening and is controlled. In this sense, border areas, zones, countries and cities are not marginal to the constitution of a public sphere, but rather at the center. So the paradox here is that in an era of globalization, borders were supposed to just disappear. Instead, borders have multiplied to the extent that they are everywhere. And of course, they are not linked simplistically to any idea of a line or a territory or a place. And of course, all of these current reflections on the mobility, the elusiveness, the changing nature of borders has also led scholars to rethinking the very nature of territory and the relationship between cultural forms and space in general. So, for example, I really recommend this study by Stuart Elden on the origin of the territory. So it's a Foucauldian study of how the very notion of territory started and originated. And as Elden writes, this expansion of borders, this rethinking of political units today, also implies that when we think geography in general or space, we cannot take to be a static, passive background to cultural forms or processes. Rather, as Elden writes, the territory is something shaped by and the shaper of, different kind of processes, historical, political, and cultural. And as Anthony Gormley shows very well, I think, with his own bodies multiplied on Crosby tide line, of course, the landscape there, the ecosystem of which these artworks are now part, is actively shaping the meaning of these artworks and how we experience them. So, of course, we cannot take the relation between figure and background for granted anymore. To conclude, really, I think some of the wider implications of this kind of questions, so how do we think borders? What's the implication of this reimagination of borders on the study of literature and history, in cultural forms in general? Well, in my view, this suggests that probably we need a new vocabulary, a new set of narratives to make sense of the changing regimes of mobility today. Of course, the very study of literature, for example, which traditionally is partitioned according to language or nation, you speak of English literature as if it had a stable meaning. Well, of course, we cannot take that for granted. We need to reimagine how geography and history are actually reshaping the very borders and territories of our object of study. And in part, of course, the rise of world literature today as a new paradigm is a response to this kind of changing natures of borders and territories. Also, as probably you noted from my presentation, I mentioned the work of geographers, philosophers, even social scientists. Probably these kind of questions might open up new interdisciplinary conversations. So, of course, there is a lot of work going on issues that are relevant to us in other disciplines like cultural geography. And of course, I hope this kind of, raising this kind of question might open up new possibilities for, conversations. And to conclude, the question of borders and territories can also potentially become a question about the politics of representation itself. So the act of representing as, in a way, a form of bordering or a reimagining of territory and border, and so open up really another kind of conversation on the political implications of our study and the literatures we analyze. Well, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Filippo and Emily and Kathy, for 3 fantastic papers there. I think we'll take 2 or 3 minutes just to perhaps get a bit of fresh air, perhaps get a drink and just stretch our legs. If you could be back for just after 10 to, that would be great. Thank you.